Hi, Robert.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and in fact, this is The Wright Show. You are Robert Becker, and you are in Cairo, which is an interesting place to be for a couple of reasons. One is that the Egyptian elections are going on this weekend, and there's been a lot of turmoil in the political system, including the dissolution of Parliament, not by Parliament. And we'll talk about that. But your story is in itself very interesting and in a way related to all of this. You went to Egypt for an NGO that helps nations make transitions to democracy, among other things. It's called the National Democratic Institute. It's a nonpartisan American NGO. There were other people doing similar things, some of them with Egyptian NGOs, some of them with foreign NGOs. And then, I guess at the very end of last year, the government raided the offices of all these groups and arrested people associated with them. And the foreigners were subsequently allowed to leave. So all the Americans came back to America except for you, right?
Correct. You
chose to stay in Egypt. Do you want to explain why you did that?
Well, the primary reason, there were armed raids conducted on 5 different organizations at the end of last year. There were 43 individuals charged from these 5 different NGOs. And from the NDI side, it was a mixture of Americans and Europeans and Egyptians. My primary motivation for staying is my Egyptian colleagues. There are 4 that are charged. And they all worked in my department. 2 of them worked directly for me. And as a matter of principle, I couldn't flee the country and leave them behind to face these charges alone.
Okay, so as a result, you face charges yourself, and in fact, you are now in the middle of your trial, right?
Yes. I have 2 charges against me, which are, I'm not guilty of them. I'm charged with illegally managing an NGO and illegally receiving foreign funds. I would prefer to say that I'm charged with 2 felony counts of teaching democracy. So the trial is underway. There have not been any witnesses or evidence introduced so far. It's all been a procedural process. I was initially, along with other international colleagues, put on a travel ban. The ban has since been lifted. There has been a bail paid on my behalf, and I am now free to come and go under the promise that I continue to appear in court when there are hearings.
Mm-hmm. And I gather your staying there is something of an inconvenience for both the Egyptian government and the American government. Is that right?
It's been framed that way. I am not alone anymore. There is an Egyptian-American, Sharif Mansour, who was from the Freedom House, who returned last week on his own, voluntarily.
Okay.
There is also a German woman from the Konrad Adenauer Association who has also returned. So there are 3 foreigners, or 2. I mean, Sharif is actually considered Egyptian, although he does have U.S. citizenship as well. And then there are 14 Egyptians that are consistently in the cage for these charges.
Mm-hmm. But the hope of the American government, I don't know if it was involved in negotiating the release of the Americans, but I think the hope was that they could kind of put this behind them. It was a problem for Egyptian-American relations that these Americans were arrested, and so it looked like this was kind of going to get smoothed over once if the Americans could be released, and so this is a little bit of a fly in the ointment.
Yes and no. I was under intense pressure to leave. There's no secret about that.
From where? From where did the pressure come from?
Pressure was coming from NDI. In fact,
from your NGO.
Yeah, 6 days after I appeared in court, I received a letter from them terminating my employment. So that's how upset they were with my actions. I was told that if all the foreigners would leave, the Egyptian courts would go easy on the Egyptians, but there was no guarantee of that, because the flip side of that is they could have retaliated against them. From my own personal standpoint, we came to this country to teach. We had 3 sort of major thrusts that we were working on. One, the department I did, we were teaching how to run political campaigns, how to build political parties, brand new industry here, because it was more or less a one-party state for 30 years with some opposition parties, but you had so many brand new political parties competing, so we were in a teaching mode. We also had a division that worked with civil society organizations, citizen groups, and then we also did voter education and voter monitoring. So it's my belief that if you're going to come here and work and export, democracy, and especially when you're going to hire local staff to work with you, that you've got to stick with them. And at every sort of pressure point and argument made against me, I could not see myself abandoning these four individuals that I worked closely with over the last year.
Okay. And maybe we should say, by way of orientation, NDI, the NGO you work for, it is a non-governmental organization, but to look at the website, it seems to me like very much a Washington establishment organization. I mean, the chairman of the board is Madeleine Albright, and it's a nonpartisan thing, but in terms of pressure that would be brought to bear on you, I would think that reflects some sort of disposition of mainstream American political establishment. Maybe I'm wrong, but...
Well, it is Washington-based. It does receive funding. It's a grantee organization, which gives us a freedom to sort of operate as we please throughout the world. Not in a contractor where we would be subject to our actions being dictated by the government. But it's an organization that's been around for almost 30 years. We've operated in over 100 countries. We have an extremely large Arabic library for political parties and civil society, and we've been in Egypt for 6 years. Obviously, post-revolution, there was a ramp up with more democracy assistant grants being awarded, and then there were a lot of other organizations that were working in similar fields. So, yes, it is an American institution, but they like to perceive themselves as a global entity.
Okay. And what kinds of things were you involved in on the ground? What's an example of the way you were spending your day when you were doing this work?
Well, I arrived almost exactly 1 year ago. At the time, last June, you had an explosion of brand new political parties. I think there were 2 or 3 that had been licensed at that point, and at one point we were tracking well over 100. We were teaching the fundamentals of how to build a political party and simultaneously how to run a campaign. We did multi-party sessions where you could have 40 or 50 people in a room for a seminar on how to build a campaign organization, and there could be Islamists in the room, liberals, seculars, socialists, and then we also did more sort of one-on-one training directly with political parties. Of all stripes.
Including the Muslim Brotherhood Party?
Yes, Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafi Party, the Al-Noor. There were 22 different political parties that had elected representatives to the current, past parliament. All 22 of those political parties had somebody come through our door at some point between us starting the program and the eventual elections in November.
And I don't know if you could really comment on this, but you've done this in other countries. Is there a way of saying, in a kind of comparative way, how ready Egypt seemed for democracy in terms of, institutional foundations, the nature of its culture? I mean, did you feel you had reason to be optimistic, or what?
Well, yes and no. There was a very fast run-up to the November elections. The political parties have been roundly criticized here, and I think some of the criticism is unfair. They had to go through a process of becoming a licensed and registered political party. They had to have 5,000 notarized members from, I think it was minimum of 15 governments around the country. So, a labor-intensive process to just get qualified. And then once you got your political license, there was an election coming, but it was kind of a moving target. Initially it was September, then it was moved to November. And in the sort of the period from when I arrived, June, until the actual elections in late November, there were 18 major legal changes to the electoral law. And these would have major impacts on candidate recruitment, strategy, et cetera. So I don't know that they were necessarily ready, but they were very eager. despite the problems and complications through the fall. You had a generally free and fair election for the first time in Egypt's history. You had an extraordinarily high turnout of, I think it was 30 million plus people voted, queued in long lines, over the course of a 3-stage election where they did bits of the country in different stages. So I credit the Egyptian people, I credit the political parties, I credit the judicial system, because all of these elections were run by the judges. So it's sort of a yes and no answer. They got there, despite the difficulties. They had the first free and fair election in the country's history. And then now, on June 16th, 6 months later, that parliament has been dissolved.
Okay. And do you think that this election will be free and fair?
It's hard to tell. During round one, there were a lot of allegations. Now, I've been saying in my particular case, sort of the crackdown on NGOs, an important piece to this is the day that we were raided, we were one of 9 international election observation missions that were officially accredited by the Egyptian government. In fact, the day that I had to report for interrogation in January was the first day of the Shura elections, which is the upper house, and we were monitoring those elections. Now, the ripple effect of this crackdown, because it's gone beyond just the 5 organizations. There's an estimated 400 local and Egyptian and international NGOs that are currently under some sort of an investigation. You had a drop-off in election monitors. During the parliamentary elections in November, December, there were 27,000 accredited election monitors, international and domestic, Egyptian eyes watching the Egyptian process. That number decreased to 9,000 that were accredited for this election. So that's the ripple effect. That is fear and funding that have caused that drop-off. Now, today there are over 13,000 polling locations, and there's only 9,000 observers that are out there watching the process. So there have been some initial allegations today on voter intimidation, voter fraud. So it's very difficult to tell how free and fair this round will be, because it's going to be, a partial report by there's 3 international observation missions that are ongoing, but they're woefully understaffed.
And is it your view that a primary goal of the crackdown that you were subject to and the other NGOs were subject to was, in fact, to leave more room for manipulation of the election that's happening right now?
I think it was broader than that. This crackdown has been sort of across the board. The argument that was made against us was that these organizations were operating without a license, which is simply not true. The timing of it, we had, for our organization, we had just issued a couple of reports that said the first 2 rounds of the parliamentary election were free and fair. We had signed off on the process and had praised the Egyptian people and the electoral system and the judicial system. So I don't know if it was aimed at that. But there's a number of things that have happened in the last 6 months that sort of do a lead up to what a lot of people are calling a soft coup. Civil society has been thwarted. Democracy will not survive if citizens are afraid to organize and speak out. There's been a de facto martial law that's been issued in the last couple of days. The dissolution of Parliament. So there's been a number of factors that have led us to this point where, if all goes according to the plan the next couple of days, you will have a newly elected president with no parliament and no constitution, a martial law in place, and a civil society that is not functioning anywhere near its fullest potential, and an ongoing state TV campaign of television ads accusing foreigners of being spies. So there's a lot of elements that lead to this sort of being a soft coup condition. The outcome of this election is going to dictate sort of the next move, but I fear that there's trouble ahead.
So is it your sense that this really is all of a piece? Going back to the crackdown on the NGOs that led to your arrest in late December, and moving forward to the dissolution of Parliament only this week, is it your sense that this was part of a kind of a coherent plan?
It's sure looking that way. I mean, the legal argument for dissolving Parliament is fuzzy at best. There was actually a tweet I saw the other day, how can something be declared unconstitutional when there is no constitution? I mean, the country is operating under a temporary constitution, but you had a very complicated election system that SCAF was in charge of, that would be the military council. You had all the political parties sign off on the 18 changes. So, the constitutional sort of legal argument, and I'm not an attorney, but it's been called an absurd legal reasoning behind the dissolution. The unfortunate thing is that you've now disenfranchised the votes of 30 million people. So is it part of something? Sure, looks that way. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to come this far to having an ongoing presidential election to then take the only democratically elected institution in the country and wipe it out.
Okay, so going forward, let's first look at kind of the darkest scenario, or at least a relatively dark scenario. In other words, how does the military council completely derail democracy? I mean, it sounds like they're not that far from it, right? I mean, they've dissolved Parliament. The actual, regardless of who wins this election, the actual powers that a president is going to have are quite unclear, right? And if the de facto maker of rules is the military council, the presidency could presumably turn out to be a pretty impotent office, right?
Yes. I mean, the separation of powers between presidential, judicial, and legislative are not defined. You have two scenarios moving forward. If Ahmed Shafiq, the so-called Falul candidate, the remnant, former prime minister under Mubarak, if he wins, then he is seen as the military's choice, and there is no parliament to counterbalance him. And then the military council has announced that they will be forming a constitutional commission. If the Muslim Brotherhood candidate wins, Mohammed Morsi, he is a president without a parliament. The parliament was more or less controlled by his party, the Freedom and Justice Party. So you have a situation where there will be a president, but no clear definition of powers going forward due to the lack of a parliament and the lack of a constitution.
So if Morsi is elected, there would at least be tension between the aspirations of the president and the aspirations of the ruling military council.
Yes.
Whereas if Shafiq wins, there won't even be that, and basically it sounds like the coup will be complete, the revolution didn't work.
Yeah, well, the revolution when it started, you had a unifying factor with former President Mubarak. He was universally despised by liberals, secularists, socialists, labor unions, Islamists. So you had a unifying factor. Now, since that time, everyone has sort of gone their different ways in the struggle for power with the elections last fall and the elections to the president. But if Shafiq wins, then you have another unifying factor again. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, who has been roundly criticized for how they govern, but have played by the rules as set forth by the SCAF, who has suddenly lost a presidential election and lost a parliament that they controlled. So you would have another unifying factor between the revolutionary forces, the secular forces, and the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood, in that they can now all unify behind their hatred for Shafiq, who is basically viewed as a rerun of Mubarak.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say about the prospects for an actual, round two of the revolution in that situation? And can we get any evidence about that from just the last couple of days? What the reaction has been to the dissolution of Parliament?
Well, the reaction has been curious. There's been sort of outrage, but it's been muted outrage. Nobody really took to the streets. Now, the most outraged party would be the Freedom and Justice Party, the Muslim Brotherhood Party, as well as the Salafi Party, Al-Noor, because they were the controlling majority of Parliament, and they have lost that. But they didn't take to the streets. They decided to forge on with the presidential election. And I think part of that is, politically, both of those parties are very disciplined. So I think they have an incredible election machine. I think they're going to fight this round, and if they win, then they will deal with the loss of Parliament. If they lose, they will have even more reason to sort of express their outrage on the streets. So, there's been some voices in Egypt that have applauded the dissolution of Parliament because it was Islamist-based, and quite frankly, I think those people are dead wrong. 30 million people voted. The Islamists won a controlling majority because that's the way the people voted. I mean, you may not have liked the outcome. In my country, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I did not like the Tea Party, winning a bunch of seats the last election cycle, but it's certainly, I don't think we should dissolve the Congress. So, I think the Islamist forces are waiting to see what happens with this presidential election, and if they wake up Monday morning and have nothing, no parliament, no presidency, I think you're going to see them take the fight to the streets.
And there is this view that in that sense, the best thing for democracy in the long run is for Shafiq, the Mubarak holdover, to win so that the opposition will at least be united.
Yes and no. I mean, my fear is that if Shafiq wins, that this could get the civil disobedience could get very violent. Shafiq, during round one, there were 13 candidates contending for the presidency. Shafiq went overboard on his rhetoric, and in a multi-candidate race, it was the right strategy. There is a strong element in Egypt that are sort of tired of the revolution. They want stability, they want security, they want life to sort of get back to normal. So he played to those fears with supercharged rhetoric about, not tolerating protests. And so I think there's going to be a battle of wills. You have the revolutionary forces would now, in this scenario, would be joined by very disciplined, very organized Islamist forces. Then my fear is that while some might argue that it's good, it could be more violent than it was 16 months ago. If Morsi wins, at least there is, a little bit of a stick in the mud, and some semblance of opposition holding at least, a nominal position of power. But moving forward, you still have two major items, and that's what to do about electing a new parliament and what to do about the constitutional crisis.
And what were the grounds for dissolving, the stated grounds for dissolving Parliament? It was actually done by the Supreme Court, right?
Yes. Well, Egypt had a very complicated and bizarre election system from the holdover of the old regime. It was a series of rules and regulations that were basically designed to help the ruling party continue to win large numbers in the parliamentary elections. And with the birth of so many new parties, there was a strong push to have a proportional political party system. So in an effort to try to make everybody happy, which in politics is always impossible, they created one of the most bizarre and complex election systems in the world. And what ultimately ended up is that they had a 2/3 proportional voting system and then a 1/3 majoritarian or individual voting system. So your typical voter, actually every voter would show up in their polling place and they would be handed a ballot of political parties who have filed on the proportional side. So in a typical district in Cairo, that could have been 8 seats would be up for grabs. And the voters would make a choice amongst one political party out of maybe 12 to 15 to 20 parties that had filed. Then they would be handed a ballot where they would vote for 2 individuals. One would have to be a designated worker farmer, which is a holdover law from the Mubarak time. And then one would be a straight professional individual. So they would essentially have 3 votes.
Okay.
Now, that's a long way of getting at what the court ruled. The court ruled that the 1/3 majoritarian system was supposed to be independents only, so that no individual running as either a professional or a worker farmer could be backed by a political party. At the 11th hour, the political parties last year raised this issue strongly, that this would basically allow the former NDP, the former regime party, to essentially gain control of 1/3 of Parliament, and they argued that individuals should be allowed to have party backing in that round. The SCAF agreed. So what happened on that 1/3, most of those seats were won by the Islamists. The Freedom and Justice Party controlled 48% of Parliament. When you took away those seats, their control dropped to like 35%. So they dominated that round. So the ruling was that it was illegal for political parties to back candidates in that. Now, what's unclear is why that would result in a total dissolution of Parliament. Again, I'm not an attorney. I don't pretend to understand the constitutional law, but there's 2/3 of Parliament that played by the rules. There's the 1/3 of Parliament. There are some members of Parliament who ran as independents who won, who's now losing their seat. They won against other candidates backed by parties. So, I think what would be hopeful is, regardless of the presidential, is that clearer minds can sort this out, and instead of dissolving all of Parliament, just rerun the seats that are affected would be the smarter way to do this, so that you don't have no Parliament moving forward.
Right. But is there any serious reason to believe that this was an earnest ruling? In other words, that this was anything other than a cynical power play, an attempt to dissolve what was, from the point of view of the military, an overly Islamist Parliament?
I've not seen any sort of sound legal reasoning for the ruling. Again, there's a lot of gray area in Egyptian law. The NGO laws that my organization, my colleagues are charged under, is an example of a very gray area. I think they could have come out with a ruling that said, the following seats are a do-over because of this legal interpretation, without dismissing the entire Parliament. But again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer.
And is the sense that they do have to have elections? They do have to somehow reconstitute a Parliament that is perceived as legitimate. I mean, the Parliament itself now has a long enough history, I gather, so that they can't get away just suddenly not having an elected Parliament.
Yeah, well, I mean, the ruling council, the generals, have declared that they're going to hand over power at the end of the month. They were going to hand it over to an elected Parliament and an elected president. So the transfer of power sort of requires that there be a Parliament. Now, the next president is supposed to swear an oath to that Parliament. There has been a legal ruling I saw yesterday that they will now make that oath to the Supreme Court. But you can't have a functioning government without all the parts in place. A lot of people have been applauding the dissolution of Parliament because it was controlled by Islamists. But again, I disagree with people applauding that. That's the will of the people. The people elected a majority Islamist Parliament. And a lot of people are applauding the Parliament because they hadn't done a whole lot in the 3 or 4 months they were actually constituted. And part of that's an unfair characterization. You can't undo the wrongs of 30 years in 3 months, number one. Number two, any laws passed would be going to an interim government for enactment. Now, having said that, if I were advising the Freedom and Justice Party, I would have told them to go ahead and pass laws that the masses who came out to vote want. I would have passed laws that had a jobs plan to put people back to work. I would have passed laws that administered some justice for the martyrs of the revolution. I would have passed laws that reconstituted the security. Those are what the voters wanted when they voted. Despite the fact that they probably wouldn't have been enacted, you still dump those at the feet of the interim government, dump those at the feet of SCAF. They could have at least said, hey, we did our part. We passed these laws. But they didn't go that route. So a lot of people viewed the Parliament as a bit of a joke for being ineffectual. But again, it's straight politics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, final question about the election before I ask you a little more about your own situation. Is your sense that, okay, it sounds like there is now more room for shenanigans and manipulation of electoral results than there was in the last election, just in the sense that the monitoring forces have been somewhat depleted. Is it nonetheless your sense that if Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, wins a sufficiently overwhelming victory in terms of the actual voting, that even with even with the manipulation available, he could not be denied the victory. In other words, is there some limit, do you think, on how thorough the corruption could be?
I think there is. One of the aspects of this, in the last 2 weeks, there's various sort of components to a successful national campaign. Shafiq, I think, has clearly sort of won the message war. Morsi was the backup candidate for the Freedom and Justice Party. There were a lot of jokes that he was the Muslim Brotherhood's spare tire. Their initial nominee, al-Shader, was denied, on a legal ruling, denied the nomination, so they put Morsi in. Having said that, during round one, Morsi still finished first. The Muslim Brotherhood's political organization is a world-class organization, and in this round, they also have the backing of the Al-Noor Party, which was the second strongest finisher in the parliament. They're very organized at the street level. Now, the one thing, the irony of this, one of the training programs that we did in the run-up to the parliamentary election was teaching party agents, essentially poll watchers, how to observe the election and report fraud and abuse. And so the parties that were that had the highest turnout to NDI's training programs were the Islamist parties. They took our manual, which was done in Arabic, which was a checklist of things to watch for in an election.
What's an example of something that was on that checklist?
Watching for procedures. Are the voters, when they come in, are they presenting their ID to the election monitor? Are they signing next to their name? Are they getting the indelible ink on their picture? Observing the election judges to make sure that there are no party activists that are inside the polls trying to influence votes, making sure that people have privacy when they vote. So during round one of the parliament and in the first round of the presidential, there's not a polling place in this country where there was not somebody inside that polling center from the Muslim Brotherhood or from the Salafi parties that was observing and reporting back to their headquarters. Mm-hmm. So any shenanigans that are ongoing right now and overnight and into tomorrow, they are very disciplined and very organized. So I think that's an effective countermeasure. I've seen reports today that the Shafiq campaign is using sort of the old tactics of the regime with so-called thugs at the polling places and trying to do intimidation. But the Brotherhood's a strong force, so they've got their people out. So that is a good counterbalance to any sanctioned or unsanctioned irregularities or intimidation that may be going on.
But one thing I've always wondered about these election monitoring things, when Jimmy Carter goes over to a country and deems things fairly free and fair, who's watching the actual counting of the ballots? Isn't there just almost inherently room for making stuff up at that point? How transparent can that really be?
Well, there is some room for it, and the international and domestic monitors have had instances in the prior rounds where they weren't allowed to watch that. But the political parties and the candidates themselves have had strong presence in the room.
They did.
The best sort of solution to any counting manipulation is Egyptian eyes watching each other. So right. You will have, tomorrow night when the polls close, you will have in every polling center in this country, there will be Muslim Brotherhood observers watching, and I guarantee you there will be Shafiq observers watching. So
they will have agreed on the number you get from each precinct or polling station.
They'll agree, or there will be an argument about it. But again, it's very hard to cheat on counting and math when both sides have observers at the table. Now, if you start hearing reports that people are being kicked out of that process, then there is a lot of room for fraud. But I think there's been enough of a sort of an allegation that the former regime is up to their old tricks that I think this is a different era. It would be much harder to steal this thing by shutting the Muslim Brotherhood out of the polls. That would further infuriate them and give them more moral high ground to hit the streets should they lose.
Okay. Now, you've been doing your work there how long?
Well, I've been here for 1 year. I basically stopped working in January. The raid was in late December. We went ahead with our third round observation mission in early January. And while our offices were stripped and gutted, they seized computers, files, maps off the wall, etc. We weren't officially ordered to shut down. We did limit our operation, but I actually worked right up until the moment I found out via Twitter that I had been charged with these felonies. I was actually in a meeting with 4 brand new members of Parliament who had requested a meeting with us because they wanted to discuss how they organize themselves internally in terms of coalition building to be an opposition caucus. They were Liberal Party members. And they also were interested in could we do training on how they set up constituent operations in their home districts. It was in the middle of that meeting that I found out via Twitter that I had been charged, and I more or less announced to them that apparently this meeting is against the law, and I'm going to have to excuse myself because I've just been charged.
Mm-hmm. And what's the maximum penalty you face now?
I face 6 years, up to 6 years.
Do you have any sense for how likely that is? I assume that the government would really like for you to go away, which would mean acquitting you.
That would be a perfect scenario for me. I don't.
You're in favor of acquittal?
Yeah.
You're going on record as being in favor of your acquittal.
I am absolutely in favor. I mean, look, there's a couple things leading up to this. I mean, I am taking a good personal risk. I weighed these options long and hard. I could have very easily gotten on a U.S. government plane and flown away with everybody else, but I just couldn't live with my conscience having left behind these 4 young Egyptians that had devoted their lives to working, for the organization and directly for me. Now, having said that, ironically, as an Egyptian government-sanctioned election observer myself, one of the things I witnessed during the parliamentary election was the amazing job that the judges did throughout the country in managing this very complicated and very confusing balloting situation. Every internal operation I observed where the judge was in charge, a high degree of integrity, a high degree of respect for the rule of law and the procedures, so I was personally very impressed with the integrity of the judicial process during that. Secondly, I mean, this is a long process. There were 55 boxes of evidence that were seized from 17 different NGO offices around the country. There are 43 defendants. There are thousands of pages of computer log evidence. So this trial, if it runs its normal course, and that's the one thing about the Egyptian judiciary system, is that it will. If it's going to be a trial, it will take a long time. They're very methodical. So this trial, short of a dismissal, could take a year, maybe more, just to wade through the sheer volume of evidence.
Are you fairly free in the meanwhile?
I am. I returned to the United States back in May for a very short visit, and it confused quite a few of my friends and colleagues. They thought that I was jumping bail. The bail system here is very different than it is in the United States. I was restricted from travel before I was formally charged. Following the raid, they put a blanket sort of freeze on the travel of several of the foreigners only, that the Egyptians were under no such ban. And part of the agreement the U.S. government made with the Egyptian judicial system, which has enraged quite a few Egyptians because of the way it was handled, but part of the agreement to lift the travel ban was that a bail was paid for all of us. My bail was £2 million or $330,000 US dollars, but my bail agreement allows me to come and go as I please, as long as I continue to show up in court. So there was about a 6-week break from late April to our last hearing a week or so ago. So I took the opportunity to travel and went back to the U.S. for 10 days.
So if I went to Cairo, we could have coffee?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's an incentive.
And you're welcome. Coffee, tea. It's funny, for a country that depends so much on tourism, there has been these sort of anti-foreigner sort of campaigns. I mean, there was this bizarre television ad that was launched a week ago saying, "Don't talk to foreigners," and I can tell you, to somebody who's never been here, you might be afraid to come. But despite the problems, it's a wonderful country. I have never felt threatened on the streets of Cairo. Myself personally, everybody in my neighborhood, all the Egyptians, they know exactly who I am. My days of being obscure are over. My picture was on the front page of every Egyptian newspaper the day after I appeared in court.
Oh, really? So you're a little bit of a celebrity when you walk around.
Unfortunately, for every morning
must have its virtues.
Yes and no. It's not something I'm comfortable with. I've managed political campaigns for over 20 years, and I've prided myself of being sort of the behind-the-scenes guy. So that has been blown. But the morning after I made my appearance back in March, I stuck to my usual routine. I went down to the corner newspaper stand to get a couple of the English newspapers that were available, and the newspaper man, who I've been seeing for every day for 7 straight months, looked at me, and he looked at the newspaper rack, and he saw my picture on the cover of everything, and he was like, "Oh," and welcome, and wanted to give me all the papers and not charge me for them. So,
and you didn't take him up on that?
No, I paid for my papers. But
oh, man.
I would encourage people to still continue to come to Egypt. I mean, obviously there is some difficulties here. I mean, sexual harassment is a chronic problem here. But I mean, you can still come see the pyramids. You can still come see the ancient mosques, and but there are some risks. But it's going to take some time for that to stabilize. But
not like risks of death, but risks of
harassment.
Right.
I would advise you that if you were to come, you might want to be careful in Sinai. There's the Bedouins have been doing quite a few kidnappings of late. But as somebody joked the other day, the Bedouins are known for their wonderful tea, and usually whoever they kidnap is released by the end of the day unharmed. So people have joked that if you go to the Sinai, you could get kidnapped, but you'll have some good company and some good tea, and you'll be released later in the day.
But you do need somebody to pay a ransom, presumably.
Well, usually they ransom foreign tourists for people that are in prison. So.
Really?
Yeah.
And they get them? So the government does the deal?
Yeah. No, it's been happening quite a bit the last few months. It's bizarre.
Wow.
I mean, you see it that. Just yesterday, a Singapore man was kidnapped in the Sinai, and he was released by sundown. I didn't catch what the terms of his release were, but he was released unharmed.
That doesn't sound like that bad a deal if you got the tea in the meanwhile.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's going to be a long time before Egypt returns to, it's sort of the glory that it wants to be. But in the meantime, despite everything that's going on, I don't feel unsafe here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, good. Then maybe I will go to Cairo and look you up.
Come on by.
And meanwhile, thanks so much for taking the time. We'll keep track of your case along with events there in general, and maybe check back in.
Yeah, I'm due to return to court, ironically, on July 4th.
Really? Well, we'll see if that turns out to be Independence Day for you.
Yeah, well, when it was announced last hearing, there were 14 of my Egyptian colleagues all turned around inside the cage and looked at me and smiled. So hopefully it'll be a good omen.
Okay. Well, good luck with that.
Okay. Appreciate it.
And we'll be watching. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Thanks, Bob.
Bye-bye.